Greetings, comrades, friends, and all supporters of African History Club. Welcome to episode number 19. I'm your host, Milton Ali Mahdi. So today we'll be looking at Julius Nyerere, Julius Kambarage Nyerere, who was the first president, the founding father of the United Republic of Tanzania, when the country became independent in 1961 from British colonial rule. It was called Tanganyika, after it united with the island of Zanzibar in 1964. Then it took on the name of Tanzania. Julius Nyerere is perhaps, I believe, the most impactful of all the African leaders, for a number of reasons, and I'll try to explore them in this episode of our podcast. When Nyerere set out to govern Tanzania, he had three primary objectives. The first was to build a united, stable country. He had witnessed what was happening in nearby Congo, where, because of Cold War intrigue between the West and the Eastern Bloc countries, the intervention of the United States, Belgium, Britain, led to the overthrow of Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first democratically elected prime minister. Elected in 1960, deposed in 1960 in September, only after 3 months, and then brutally assassinated in January 1961. So by the time Tanzania, or Tanganyika at that time, became independent, later in 1961, Nyerere was aware of the dangers that were out there. So his primary objective was to create a stable, united Tanzania. His second objective was to see to the total liberation of Africa from colonial or white minority rule, particularly the countries in Southern Africa and South Africa itself. And his third objective, which was his lifelong passion, was to create a socialist economic system in Tanzania. So let's explore each one of these goals one by one. Now, in order for anybody to get a better understanding of anything that happens in Africa, that happened then in the 1960s when Nyerere set out on his journey, and that still happens today, we must always remember this term that was popularized by Walter Rodney and Samir Amin: dependent underdevelopment. That's what African countries have been subjected to and are subjected to today in the 21st century. So let's always keep that in mind. And a more simple way to understand this is this way. If your country depends primarily on exporting mineral resources or agricultural products for its revenue, and importing manufactured products at a highly inflated price, and if you look and see that the price or the cost that you incur by importing manufactured products from the industrialized countries appreciates at an exponential rate compared to the revenue that you get from exporting primary commodities, then you can see that it's virtually impossible to break from that cycle of dependency. Now that we have that framework in mind, we can try to understand the challenges faced by Julius Nyerere as he tried to build socialism in Tanzania. But let's examine the first goal: building a stable and united country. out of the more than 120 ethnic communities that resided within the boundaries of Tanzania. Nyerere had one advantage: Kiswahili. Kiswahili is indigenous to the Eastern African countries, a fusion of African languages and some Arabic words and language. And all this originates from the historical interaction between Arab traders and then later Arab settlers on the coast of East Africa. So Kiswahili became a unifying language for the entire country, and Nyerere promoted it aggressively. He made the teaching of Kiswahili mandatory so that when you went to school, you would speak in Kiswahili, business was conducted in Kiswahili, and politics conducted in Kiswahili. So even when politicians campaigned, they had to campaign in Kiswahili without having their speeches translated into the local indigenous languages around the country. So people were literally compelled to learn the language, and they did. So that became a very positive and unifying factor. The second approach was to ban political parties based on ethnicity, based on race, based on religion. Tanzania also had, obviously, due to its historical evolution, a minority population of Europeans and Asians and Arabs as well. So that is why it was very important for Nyerere to make sure that parties were never based on race or ethnicity. And then the third thing was that he was very aggressive in promoting a one-party system in Tanzania. The ruling party was initially called the Tanganyika African National Union, TANU. Later on, it became the Tanzania African National Union, still TANU. Eventually, it evolved when the ruling parties of Tanzania united with the ruling party of Zanzibar, Afro-Shirazi, and the new party was called Chama cha Mapinduzi, which is a Kiswahili word for the Revolutionary Party, CCM. So those were the instruments that really helped Nyerere in building a cohesive, stable, and united country with nationalistic and Pan-African aspirations shared by the citizens of Tanzania. Much more stable and united compared to other countries in the region, such as Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, and many other countries in the region. Now let's look at his second goal, which was the liberation of the rest of Africa from colonial rule. So Tanzania became a haven for all the nationalist liberation movements and armies that were fighting against colonial rule. Tanzania provided a haven for the ANC, the African National Congress of South Africa. It provided a haven for Frelimo, which was fighting against Portuguese colonial rule in Mozambique. It provided a haven for the MPLA, which was fighting to end colonial rule in Angola, Portuguese colonial rule. It provided havens for ZAPU, Zimbabwe African People's Union, and ZANU, Zimbabwe African National Union, which was led by Robert Mugabe, and ZAPU was led by Joshua Nkomo, and both fighting for the liberation of Zimbabwe, which was then called Rhodesia and was ruled by a white minority regime under Prime Minister Ian Smith and backed by the West and the former colonial power, Britain. So essentially it was a continuation of colonialism in what was called Rhodesia. But the British were very sly, and they tolerated it when the minority white population in Rhodesia had what they called a unilateral declaration of independence, UDI, under Ian Smith in 1965. But in essence, it was just a continuation of British colonial rule under disguise in Rhodesia. So by providing all these liberation armies with haven, with training facilities, and then serving as the conduit by which weapons coming in from the Eastern Bloc countries and coming in from the Soviet Union, coming in from China, were then funneled to all these liberation movements. Nyerere made a very significant contribution toward the fight for independence in all these Southern African countries. And in the case of the former Portuguese colonies of Mozambique, and particularly Angola, we also must acknowledge the tremendous contribution by Cuba under Fidel Castro. In fact, Cuban contribution in terms of weapons and manpower, soldiers that fought along African liberation fighters, was instrumental in preserving the Angolan state when it was threatened by the UNITA, which was led by Jonas Savimbi and was financed by the CIA and financed by South Africa. And in the late 1980s, South Africa actually invaded Angola and to support UNITA and occupied parts of Angola. But then Castro sent about 30,000 soldiers, sent sophisticated weapons, artillery pieces, and they were able to destroy the South African army and forced it to withdraw from Angola in late 1987, early 1988, after the Battle of Quito Cuanavalle. And that led to the liberation of what was then Southwest Africa, ruled and occupied by South Africa. And it became the nation of Namibia. It also led directly to the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990 in South Africa, because South Africa realized that it was actually much weaker than it thought it was. And it led ultimately to the first election where all the nationalities and races could participate in South Africa. And Nelson Mandela ended up becoming the president of South Africa in 1994 and brought to an end formal apartheid in South Africa. So Nyerere was able to witness all these evolutions and success in terms of the liberation struggle in Southern Africa, to which he made a tremendous contribution. He essentially compelled ZAPU and ZANU under Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe to unite their fighting forces and fight under an umbrella called the Patriotic Front. And they were about to defeat Ian Smith's minority racist regime toward 1979. And then the British interceded and did what they should have done in 1965, called the parties together in London and what was called the Lancaster Conference Agreement, and it led to the liberation of Rhodesia, and it became Zimbabwe. And in 1980, Robert Mugabe won the first democratic election where all the nationalities and races were allowed to participate. So Nyerere was highly successful on that front, primarily because he mobilized other African countries, like Zambia, for example, like Uganda initially, and later on after Mozambique became independent, mobilized all these countries to focus on the liberation struggle, and they met regularly together to discuss the liberation struggle under the umbrella of what was called the frontline states. Many of the meetings were held in Tanzania, and it forced the West to acknowledge that they had to deal with the frontline states and with Julius Nyerere. And many Western officials had to go to negotiate with all these liberation movements, together with Nyerere presiding over these meetings in Tanzania. So, for example, Henry Kissinger had to go and meet multiple times with Julius Nyerere and other American officials, such as Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Chester Crocker. So by making Tanzania the hub and haven for the liberation struggle, Nyerere saw this come to a very successful fruition in terms of the liberation struggle against colonial rule in Southern Africa. So now let's examine the last objective, the one which he held very passionately, and the one that caused tremendous challenge. And you can understand and appreciate this, and that is why I said the preface in the beginning when I discussed the whole dependency notion of the metropole